The second presentation is supposed to be a workshop, and it's a workshop about how we move forward as a group, again, following Godly. I'd like to, before I start, to let you know that it's the nature of a workshop that you present a general idea, and then we cull ideas from the people gathered for the workshop. Unfortunately, that's not possible now. So I want you to understand that I consider this talk open-ended. I'm not concluding the talk as such when we go through. And I would like to begin with an experience of my son. I have an adopted son, and he was principal of a school in California. And when he became principal, he was there a couple days, and he began to notice the number of very, very expensive cars in the parking lot. And by expensive cars, I mean Lamborghinis, Ferraris. I'm talking very expensive European sports cars, cars that would cost over $100,000. And he saw these cars. He was thinking to himself, he says, I'm a teacher in California. In fact, I'm principal of a school. He says, I couldn't afford the gas for one of those, let alone to own one of them. He says, I wonder how the teachers here are getting that much money. Well, he found out it wasn't teachers, it was students. And what he did in his school there, he had several Native American communities that were involved in the school. A couple of the Native American communities were communities that actually had gambling establishments. And those that had gambling establishments had so much money they didn't know what to do with it. And in those that didn't have the gambling establishments, they were so impoverished that oftentimes their children could not get a good education, because if their child had any kind of a chance to work for a few days or something, they'd be gone from the school because their family needed the money. And so he thought it was very interesting. When he began to talk to them, he found out that these Native American young people had no interest in education. And the reason why the really poor ones had no interest in education, they knew they weren't going to be well enough prepared to go on to anything in education anyway. And the rich had no interest in education because they thought they would have that money always, and they wouldn't have to do anything in order to earn money. So the Native American group that constituted a little over half of the school was not interested in education at all. And so having said that, I'd like to tell you now something. When I began studying about the Native Americans, actually, I knew a lot about my own background and this sort of thing, but I never seriously studied Native Americans as a study. I was very interested in the religion in different communities, but as a study. But when I began as a study, I went to about 6 workshops in different universities. And one of the things that was said, this was said in 4 separate workshops, 4 different universities by 4 different professors. And they were talking, and they said the defeat of the Native Americans was due to 2 things. Number 1 was disease, and number 2 was disorganization. It says those 2 things defeated the Native Americans. And then they went on to say something that was really striking to me. They said if either one of those had been missing, the Native Americans would never have been defeated by the Europeans. Either one had been missing. And you think about it, I told you in the other talk, I told you that at the time of Columbus's arrival, there were more people in the Americas than there were in all the countries of Europe combined. So there was a strong force here. And I think you know, if you study much about the Native Americans, particularly when the Plains natives, the Cheyenne and the Sioux, When they got horses and guns, they were much better at this soldiering business than were the Europeans. For reasons God only knows, they were better able to fire guns from moving horses than the Europeans ever were. As a result, they would have been a powerful force. But for two things, disunity and disease. And why am I mentioning this? One of the things that my grandmother told me, and I eventually had it confirmed when I was going through psychology, I had something happen at school. Right now I can't even remember what it was. But I had something happen at school. It was very bad, and it was largely not my fault. I felt like I was a victim of it, so I was sort of commiserating with my grandmother. And my grandmother said, the most important thing for you to do is to look at the causes of what happened and find out if there's any you're responsible for. And she said, even if you're only responsible for a little tiny 10% of it and 90% of it is other people, the only part that matters is the 10%. And the reason for that is it's the only thing you can change. You can't change what other people are doing, but you can change a mistake you made so that it doesn't happen again. So she told me to analyze things that way. Once you get into psychology, that's one of the things you learn, to always look at what went wrong and what were the causes. Again, what went wrong? The defeat of the natives by the Europeans. What are the causes? Disunity and disease. Did we have any control over disease? The answer is no. There was no control over disease. In fact, the records show that the disease, as it was moving west across the country, the disease was moving faster than the Europeans. The disease just went all over everywhere. And Europeans who began the trek to come west oftentimes would come across Native American villages where no one was alive. Everyone had died of smallpox. So the disease had been brought by something, even ahead of the Europeans as they were moving. So the one thing that we could deal with is this disunity. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my grandmother again, just to show you something with regards to unity. My grandmother and grandfather were born and raised in Winnipeg at Fort Garry, and it's a Native American community, and they had a rebellion against the British, and it incidentally is the most successful rebellion against the British in all of the Americas. It was eventually put down, but it was the most successful in all the Americas against the British. And after it was put down, the Queen Victoria gave a pardon to all the people who had been involved in the rebellion. But so many of the mounted police had died in the rebellion itself that the mounted police then began to pick off members of my family, for one by one. And that's when my grandmother and grandfather came down to San Diego, where they were raised, where I was raised. But I'd like to look back at this rebellion. The rebellion was basically the Assiniboine around the Red River, the area that was called Fauchette. Fauchette is where the Assiniboine River and the Red River join, a fork. So it's called the Fauchette. And the rebellion began there and worked very powerfully. But the reason why it was so successful is because of the Metis. If you were to go down into Minnesota, there's a tribe there, the Ojibwa. And the Ojibwa, many, many years ago, began to have more and more French people move into the tribe. When the British were taking over from the French in North America, a lot of the French people discovered they had a lot more in common with Native Americans than they did with the English. And they would move in to Native American communities. And so the Ojibwa began to call them Metis, which is mixed. And this term was picked up in Canada by the Assiniboine. Although the Assiniboine usually referred, or I shouldn't say usually, originally it referred to Native Americans of mixed blood. And I think you know, as the Europeans were pushing west, our tribes were pushed into one another, one by one. So over a period of time, most people had blood from several tribes mixed in. And so they came to be known as Métis. And when this rebellion got started in Canada, they put this under the title Métis. And because they put it under the title Métis, anyone felt free to join it. If you look historically at the way Native Americans were dealt with, particularly in the United States, this wasn't as big a thing in Canada because the French were such a force and they were very, very pro-Native American. But in the United States, as the forces were moving, what they used to do was pit tribes against one another. And what they would do is have a strong tribe and a weak tribe go to war. And when they did, the American government always supported the weaker tribe. And then once the big tribe, the major tribe, had been destroyed, then they themselves destroyed the weaker tribe. And in effect, they played us against ourselves. We never had the union. But that's what they got around in Canada by using the term Métis rather than Assiniboine or Ojibwa or whatever. They used the term Métis. And when they used the term Métis, the tribes could join together. Now again, we saw that one of the major difficulties was this idea of disunity. And that is something you and I have the ability to correct today. When I look at Native Americans, I see our future as youth. And the future, our future, is in fact the future of our youth. And make no mistake about it, today the future is education. That's why what I saw at my son's school was so frightening to me, that they could not see a value in education. In Native American communities, we are plagued among our youth with addictions to drugs and alcohol and this sort of thing. And a huge number of addictions are born out of the fact that people see no future. If there's no future, there's no need to have discipline to put your life together, nothing. We need to be able to provide a future for our youth, and the future is education. I just saw a statistic the other day. They said that when we come out of this pandemic and the jobs are restructured and everything was put back together, 40% of the jobs that were lost will never return. And they will never return because education is moving and advancing. I know a young man back east, and he was applying for a job. His father had worked on an assembly line in a plant, so he applied to do the same thing. Incidentally, he has a bachelor's degree before he applied. It isn't as though he's uneducated. So he wanted to get a job on the assembly line, had paid his father very well, and he heard that there was good money on the assembly line. Now his father's retired. So he went in, and do you know the first question they asked him? They said, "Do you have a degree in robotics?" If you don't have a background in robotics, you can't work on an assembly line because there's so much of the robots involved. So what we need to do, I think, as a community is, first of all, understand that Native Americans are a community. There is something really wrong when one young man can drive a Lamborghini to school and another young man cannot go to school. That should be unknown in our community. Right now, thanks to the gambling, there are communities that have an immense amount of money. That needs to be invested in the education of all Native Americans, one way or another. And I see this very much tied to Godley with the idea of not allowing the past to cripple her, to be knowledgeable of it, but to move on to become the woman she ultimately became, in spite of all the things in the past. We are a people who survived an immense amount as a people over history. We're people who suffered an immense amount. But a lot of the problems that we had are due to this disunity, and it is something we can change. Imagine if at the time of the landing of Columbus, we as Native Americans throughout the Americas had united under a single title like Metis, and united under that title had moved against the Europeans. This would be Native American country now. We need to look to the future, and the future is our youth, and the future of our youth is their education. How do we go about them getting better educated? Now, my suggestion is that the monies, the surplus monies that are coming to some of the very wealthy tribes should be pledged to that for the poorer tribes. But again, it's a workshop. So as a workshop, I present the difficulty to you. The difficulty is the future education of our youth. How do we accomplish that? Because our future rests on theirs, and theirs rests on education. Thank you very much.